Good evening. My name is Yomaris Nunez, and on behalf of the students of La Alianza at the Harvard Law School and the students at the Latino Caucus, I'd like to welcome you to the forum this evening. We're here to kick off the 10th Annual Latino Law and Public Policy Conference in conjunction with the Law School and KSG Alumni Reunion. Our theme this year is Advancing the National Leadership Agenda. We invite you to attend any of our panels this weekend to be held over at the Law School, which will include law and KSG alumni. Tonight, we have the honor of having one of our very own alumni, Henry Cisneros, and I'd like to ask Professor Goldsmith to come up and introduce him.
Thank you. It's my honor to introduce the secretary. I was really excited about this. He's been a longtime friend until I was reading his resume and saw that he won re-election as mayor with 90-some% of the vote. I thought I got a landslide when I got up to 52% in Indianapolis. So I want to hear a little bit more about that 90%. I've known the secretary for a long period of time, and it's a real delight to introduce him, as you know, because you're here, and those of us who follow cities in the U.S., Henry was and still is known as one of the great mayors in the last 20 years or more in this country, a leader in terms of urban innovation, personal motivator, a person who brought San Antonio up several levels with respect to jobs and national attention, went on to become obviously Secretary of HUD, where I was a mayor at the time, begging for his attention. And one of the things he's best known for is his commitment to home ownership. And his efforts at HUD sparked a program many of us know called Hope 6, which brought just a wonderful improvement in what had been public housing and continuum of housing for home ownership. He now is active and is one of the major forces in affordable housing and homes for working families in this country today. A person that, regardless of whether you're Republican or Democrat, one of the true champions and thinkers of urban policy. He is slightly overeducated for a mayor. He has a MPA from here and a master's in urban design from Texas A&M, I think, and a doctorate from GW. So please help me welcome one of the country's leading mayors and urban innovators, the most overeducated mayor in America, Henry Cisneros.
Steve. Thank you. Thank you, Steve. Thank you. Thank you very much. Steve, thank you. What a treat it is to be back here in this forum, graced by this wonderful backdrop. I was here in the 1980s talking about cities as a mayor, and then in the 90s back here as HUD secretary, and this is my first time back in over a decade, and it's just a great treat to be here, especially to learn that Steve is here on the faculty. I had the opportunity to participate in a class with him this afternoon and see some 70 students taking a course in leading cities, a course that we didn't have at the Kennedy School when I was here, but I would have taken if it had been offered. Steve is the right person to teach a course like that, having been a very, very good mayor. Indianapolis has been graced with several decades of solid progress, and one of the key periods for Indianapolis was the years that Steve Goldsmith was mayor, thinking outside the box creatively about how to offer city services in different ways, and he's served now at the national level and here. Just a great treat to be able to spend some time with him today. Yomaris, felicidades, second year MPP, hard course. Good luck to you. To Bill White, thank you for your leadership of this forum. Dean McCarthy, thank you for your role here. And it's a great treat to be able to see Al Carnesale, who was dean of the Kennedy School, longtime faculty member when I was here, as a matter of fact, writing on national security issues, and then went on and was chancellor of the UCLA campus of the University of California system, and back between here and there now. What a great life. Two of the greatest places to serve in academic life in the country. And if I may just take a couple of points of personal privilege, if I may, because on occasion like this, it's a wonderful thing to see friends like Flash Wiley, who longtime activist in Boston, lawyer, great friend for lots and lots of years. Flash, great to see you. And Luis Caldera, who was Secretary of the Army in the Clinton administration, and who I assume is here with the Harvard Alumni Group, and most recently was president of the University of New Mexico. Let me ask you guys to stand, please, and just be recognized. Flash Wiley and Luis Caldera, great examples of people who've done the kinds of things that you will do with your education and make a big, big difference in the world. Congratulations to the Kennedy School a reunion group that's here, and to the law alumni who are here. I know you're going to have a great, productive several days of networking and fellowship and panels and learning, and thank you for joining us this evening for this first of the events. As I say, there's more than a little nostalgia associated with my being here tonight. When I was a student, this building didn't exist. The Kennedy School was in the so-called Litar Center, which is the building up at the head of the street there. Great experience. I had been in Washington and came here to do the one-year MPA and stayed a second year to take additional courses at MIT. And I must tell you that for 10 years after that, as a city council member and later mayor of San Antonio, I was able to take advantage of things that I had learned at the Kennedy School, and people thought I was, the smartest guy around because of what I had learned and taken home from here. It's also a wonderful place to make alliances. I used to have lunch, brown bag lunch, with this diminutive guy who was a classmate. He was in the PhD program in political economy, and we sat and talked and frequently talked in Spanish. Little did he imagine that I would ever end up mayor of San Antonio, and I did not imagine that he would end up the president of Mexico. His name was Carlos Salinas de Gortari. And there were any number of other people from that era who I then served with in the Clinton administration, including David Elwood, who now is the dean here and who was one of the really seminal people in the creation of welfare reform and really important accomplishment in the Clinton administration. When I was in the Army, they used to say, look to your right and look to your left at an opening event, because one of the three of you will not be here at the end of this course. Well, there's a kind of a different approach here at the Kennedy School. Look to your right, look to your left, because the person sitting next to you may be a future president or cabinet officer or university leader or foundation chair, and that's no exaggeration. And my experience with President Salinas is an example. I want us to talk just a little bit tonight about a dynamic that I'd like to call the Hispanization of the United States. And what I intend to do is to kind of rush through my remarks, because I think the most fruitful part of the discussion, as I look at my watch, will be if we can get into a dialogue, a question and answer. So let me spend the next 20 minutes or so rushing through some points, but trying to put this in a framework that maybe will facilitate the discussion. The Hispanization of the United States does not mean that Hispanics are going to be the majority in this country, even at, say, 2050. But it does mean that among the major massive trends reshaping American society, things like the role of technology, globalization, the aging demographic, and the role of the biosciences, all generally understood to be dramatically important megatrends, is the presence of the Latino community in the United States. It is going to be that significant. And it will take on several dimensions. The first of those dimensions is obviously population. Today, or in 2000, the American population was 280 million people. It's now about 300. Demographers tell us that in 2050, it will be about 410 million people, an increase from 2000 to 2050 of about 130 million people. Of that 130 million people, the new population that will exist in our country between now and 2050, 18 million of those will be traditional white Americans. 25 million will be African Americans. 27 million will be Asian Americans. And 63 million, almost 50% of the growth of population in the United States, according to the census mid-range conservative estimates, will be the Latino population of this country. And there are many facets to this. Obviously, our population is growing dramatically in the big states. That is hugely important politically, in California, in Texas, in New York, in Florida, which happened to be 1, 2, 3, 4 in terms of population, and oh, by the way, electoral votes. But it's also a story of our population growth in smaller places. The fastest growing Latino population in the United States in the 1990s, where it grew 400%, was Arkansas. Similar rates of growth in Georgia, where people have gone to work in the furniture industry. In the Carolinas, where Latinos have gone to work in textiles. Big numbers, sufficient for the government of Mexico to add a consulate in North Carolina and other such states. In Nevada, for example, in Washington State. Another facet of this growth is its suburban character. Latinos are not just concentrating in the cities, but rapidly growing in suburban places, inner ring older suburbs like Silver Spring, Maryland, for example, or Arlington, Virginia, but also places, smaller places in Nebraska, for example. And in many places, the Latino community is essential to growth. New York City has now achieved 8 million people. Demographers are saying batten the hatches for 9 million people in New York City in 2025, the largest influx being 1 million Dominicans into New York City over the course of the last decade or several decades. In places like in the Midwest, small places in Nebraska, small towns, the dramatic population change is Latino population, people going to work in the feedlots and going to work in the agricultural industry in those places. So all across America, the Latino population, a national phenomenon. This is not distinct to a few traditional places. In the Eastern time zone, from Boston and New York and Connecticut and New Jersey. New Jersey just elected its first United States Senator of Hispanic heritage in Bob Menendez, who was the mayor of Union City before that in a largely Cuban-American population, to Miami, which is no longer a majority Cuban, but a mix of Nicaraguan, Colombian, Honduran, and other groups, into the central heartland of the country where Chicago now has over 1 million Latinos, but substantial numbers in cities like Milwaukee and Columbus and Omaha and Des Moines and Kansas City, and of course Texas, where though San Antonio has traditionally been thought of as the cradle of Hispanic progressive politics, Houston now has more Latinos than San Antonio. New Mexico, which is the state with the largest Hispanic population percentage-wise, 40%, and where Bill Richardson, a Latino, is the governor, and then other places throughout the American West, Nevada, where Las Vegas was the fastest growing city in America in the last decade, largely due to the Latino influx, and other states like Idaho, Wyoming, but clearly California, the mother lode, where Antonio Villaraigosa is now the mayor of the second largest city in America, and a Latino will be governor or senator within the next decade or so, as we see population grow dramatically, not just in Los Angeles or San Diego, but in the Central Valley, the so-called San Joaquin Valley, from Bakersfield and Fresno and Modesto and Stockton to Sacramento, where 4 million people are expected to be added to the population, and the great number of those Latinos. So clearly one dimension of this Hispanization is sheer numbers. It's significant and reshaping the country. Another dimension is economics, where Latinos are the fastest growing segment of the middle class and will command something like $1 trillion in disposable income by 2010, over $600 billion now, larger than the GDP of every Spanish-speaking country but Mexico and Spain, right within the borders of the United States. Fastest growing segment of small business formation, including Latina-owned businesses, very important in the economics of the country. Now, this despite the fact that Latinos earn only about 2/3 of the average white household, and in terms of wealth, net worth, command less than 10 cents on the dollar as compared to white households, 1/10 of the wealth. But again, this is a story of a population that's moving because it's very hard working. I recently saw some data, for example, on the 5-county Southern California area that showed, in terms of multiple workers per household. 52% of immigrant Latino families have at least 3 workers per household. No other group in the country comes close. The next largest group is 27% of foreign-born Asians. 52%, 27%, and then every other American group arrayed beneath that. But clearly a hard-working population that, though it may work for low per capita wages, individual wages, pool incomes as family groups and begin to function as middle-class units in the society. The truth of the matter is that our population lags on income and lags particularly on wealth because it is young, therefore hasn't had a chance to amass it, because it's not as educated, because have had more limited access to financial systems, and because we are concentrated in high-growth regions of the country where housing is expensive, therefore our home ownership rate is less, therefore our equity is less, therefore our wealth is less. And because a large percentage of our population are immigrants, many of whom take years to be able to amass personal wealth because they send so much home to families, $30 billion in remittances. So the economics of the Latino community are huge and important, and a second dynamic of this Hispanization process, which will show up in American business. A third dimension of our progress is our public leadership. It takes the form of organizational progress, excellent groups like the National Council of La Raza, the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Education Fund, the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund, the Cuban National Council, the United States Hispanic Leadership Institute, and dozens of other groups, 45 of which are grouped together in something called the United States Hispanic Leadership Agenda, and articulate with common voice as never before a Hispanic agenda across a broad range of issues, from children's issues to senior citizens issues, from economic issues to health issues, but making a difference in the Washington context. And then, of course, more individuals in positions of public responsibility. We have 2 members of the cabinet right now, one of whom I watched on television today, the Attorney General of the United States. I don't know exactly how long he's going to be in that position, judging from that testimony today, but the Secretary of Commerce, Carlos Gutierrez, as well. 3 members of the United States Senate. Just a few years ago, we had no members of the United States Senate. Today, Senator Menendez from New Jersey, Senator Salazar from Colorado, and Senator Martinez from Florida, who is also the chairman of the Republican Party. So, dramatic improvement in the Senate. Mayors of cities like Los Angeles, Antonio Villaraigosa, and Miami, Manny Diaz, and of course Bill Richardson, not only the governor of New Mexico, but a legitimate candidate for the presidency of the United States, who I think is going to fare better in the debates and in the primaries than a lot of people expect. Public leadership of universities, major universities across the country, and foundations and church groups. So our public leadership is still another dimension. And by the way, many more opportunities. And this is going to be, the era of firsts is passing, but the opportunities to do good work in major leadership opportunities is immense. This is going to be a huge part of the American future. And then finally, among these dimensions, if you will, is the cultural, which I think in some sense may be the most pervasive, maybe even the most important, because when it is not possible to communicate with people, with political declarations, or even with economic statistics, it's possible for them to fall in love with music and literature and architecture and food and 1,000 other things. Music of mainstream figures like Gloria Estefan, on a spectrum that moves to Mark Anthony, and finally Daddy Yankee at the other end of the spectrum. Movies that include, for some, Andy Garcia and Jimmy Smits, and for others, Selma Hayek and Cameron Diaz. Fashion that includes Carolina Herrera and Oscar de la Renta and Paloma Picasso, and architectural groups like a group called Arquitectónica in Miami that's reshaping the skyline of the city, or an architectural firm in San Antonio headed by Henry Munoz, which just last weekend opened a new Smithsonian museum in our city that is the first Hispanic focus of the Smithsonian outside of Washington. literary figures from other countries who become U.S. citizens like Isabel Allende and Carlos Fuentes, but also our own homegrown literary figures, Raúl Villaseñor, Sandra Cisneros, and many others. And then there's sports. A-Rod and Luis Gonzalez and Sammy Sosa in baseball, but who am I to be talking to you about that in a city that's got David Ortiz and Manny Ramirez with the Boston Red Sox? In basketball, I can't not mention Manu Ginobili of the San Antonio Spurs. In golf, Sergio Garcia, who gives Tiger a run every once in a while. And boxing figures like Oscar de la Hoya, the Golden Boy. I don't know that I believe in reincarnation, but I think if I did, I'd like to come back as Oscar de la Hoya. I mean, despite all the nice things that Steve said and this wonderful platform, I think I'd rather be Oscar de la Hoya. Someone said to me the other day, you know something, if you believed in reincarnation, why not just go all the way and come back as J-Lo? So I'm trying to give you a kind of a sweep of where we are and where we're headed, and it's a picture of increasing influence and presence in this nation, from the size of our families, which are 50% larger than the average, the youth of our population, where 40% are under 20 years of age. The rest of the country, only 25% of the population is under 20 years of age. I saw the other day a age distribution for the population of Texas by ethnic group. And the white population pattern, grouped by age, 5 years old, 10, 15, 20, the bulge in the barrel shape of the population is in the kind of 40, 45, 50-year-old group. That's the biggest, fattest part of the population. But the Latino age distribution looked like a pyramid with the biggest numbers at the bottom, 5, 10, 15-year-olds. And so when you juxtapose those two things together, it's clear who are going to be in the schools. It's clear who's going to be moving through adolescence. It's clear who's going to be the workforce of the future as the population shift occurs. In some sense, the Latino future is the saving grace of our country at a time when the demographics of aging will reshape the rest of the American population. And it's a saving grace in a kind of an international sense. If you look at what's going to happen in countries like Germany, Italy, France, and Japan, where the lack of immigrants, the fact that they're not immigrant societies, has not enabled them to offset the effects of zero population growth or almost zero replacement. Japan is now a country that is actually losing population because it's not replacing. Countries like Germany and France and Italy are going to have serious questions of how they staff their militaries, how they finance their health systems, their social security systems as they age, have fewer workers per retiree, and all of the issues that come with an aging population that doesn't replace. The United States is going to have other issues, but not those, because we're going to have this massive, energetic workforce. Now, there's serious questions about whether people will be prepared for the kinds of jobs of the future with educational issues that confront us and so forth, but few questions about the raw energy that will be brought to the process by this youthful population. I think that our country, and I think the central point that I would like to make this evening, is at a new moment. And the moment embodies a logic that goes something like this. First of all, there's no question the Latino population is going to be important to the nation. To the nation. We're so numerous now that if we fail to move the needle on education for Latinos, the nation's educational statistics reflect it. If we fail to move the needle on moving to the middle class or economic statistics, the nation's prosperity suffers. We, second point, have to accept some responsibility for that future. Of all of the things that I am a Latino, I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a Catholic, I'm a Democrat, I'm a lot of things. The one that I regard as closest to the center of my being is an American. I love this country. I believe that its best days are yet ahead. But I believe that in order for its best days to yet be ahead, the Latino population must be part of that picture in a progressive and profound way. That includes, point 3, the integration of immigrants. 12 million undocumented in the country. About 8 million of those are Latino. They're not going anywhere. If we don't figure out how to integrate them into American society beyond just the basics of legalization to how they function in our economic system, in our system of productivity and employment, then the country is going to suffer mightily. And finally, we need, in this framework that I've described, counterbalancing a commitment from Latinos to work and study and pay taxes and raise our children and abide by the laws and become Americans, is an acceptance on the part of the general American population that we're going to be here, a kind of reciprocal understanding that says we will keep open the path to the middle class. We will not shut the doors on public education or shut the doors on expectations that the society can create a middle class by investing in home ownership and access to higher education and the other strategies of income that have fueled the most solid middle class in the world and the greatest economy in the world. We can continue that progress, but it requires a kind of new social understanding, a new accord. This is a place where I differ dramatically from Harvard professor Huntington, who writes as if Latinos are not willing to sign on to this dream. I'm absolutely convinced that we are, but it will require some understanding and reciprocity on the part of the larger society. Well, let me begin to wind down here just a few minutes longer by talking to you about some of the elements of public policy that are involved in maintaining open that path to the middle class. Clearly, one of them is a focus on education. This community is younger than the national average, as I've said, underperforming from an educational standpoint, and we must focus on K through 16 education, early childhood education, after-school programs, quality public education, all the litany of things that involve smaller schools, investment in schools, capital plant, et cetera. Very importantly, the transition to college, where we're underrepresented today. So investment in education would have to be very near the top of all of our agenda for how Latinos are going to be part of the American future. Almost as important is the focus on incomes, because people cannot progress to a position where their children can move to better education without some stability in their lives. And that means ending the unscrupulous business practices that take money out of our society. The check cashers who charge 3.5% of face value and generate something like $1.5 billion in fees just for cashing checks. The payday lenders who have APRs of 470%. They'll charge $54 on a 2-week loan, on a $300 2-week loan. The refund anticipation lenders who charge 13% of the value of the earned income tax credit or an early tax return. The auto markets where Latinos pay $500 more for the same car just because of the neighborhood that they're in, or 1% more for a house mortgage in interest and fees amounting to thousands of dollars over the life of the loan because of the neighborhood that they're in and the banking practices. So supplanting those unscrupulous business practices with strategies for banking the unbanked. Things like Banco Popular is doing in a program they call Acceso Popular that provide a $1 monthly fee, no minimum balance, free ATM transactions, free bill payment, and a savings pocket to help people begin to save money. I'm convinced that this agenda, which Newt Gingrich used to call the Opportunity Society, which President Bush has called the Ownership Society, which my friend Antonio Gonzalez at Southwest Voter calls the Investment Society, a kind of a convergence of themes that suggest that kind of the next big American idea in public policy is figuring out how to help people get some disposable income and through the earned income tax credit or individual development accounts or other ideas that are out there, a focus on how to have some resources. Obviously, health, because of the catastrophic effects on family budgets when people are ill. Latinos are the largest segment of the population without access to health insurance. families that must use emergency rooms as their health care because there is no insurance for them. There is no other health system. Latinos tend to work in businesses that are smaller and therefore don't offer health insurance. Big and serious question. And finally, in this litany of public policy actions that open the doors and keep them open, is immigration reform. The three-part package that has been the basis of discussion between the administration and Democrats is the right mix. Border security, because every nation has an obligation to protect its borders. You cannot define yourself as a nation if you don't have borders, and having borders means defining them and protecting them, understood. But equally important, a guest worker program that allows the 12 million people who are here and who everyone agrees are not going anywhere and effectively cannot be removed, to be able to live as human beings, to be able to come and go and see their families, to be able to come out from the shadows where they're abused by unscrupulous employers and cheated out of their wages and poor conditions and abuses. So a guest worker program is an important part of this. And then finally, a path to citizenship. Once those guest workers are here and functioning in a legal environment, a mechanism by which they can become citizens, or we live with a apartheid-style secondary class of people who are forever guest workers and not have the opportunity to move to citizenship. The devil is in the details, obviously, being negotiated now on issues related to whether or not they must go home and get in a queue or how much money they will pay in order to get in line and all of those questions. But the long and short is that sort of three-part rubric is the right mix. And that three-part framework is hopefully what I hope will pass. Critically important. The country needs these workers. They are a lifeblood of the American future, and we simply have to get them in a position to live like human beings so that their children can have a chance to be the kind of solid mainstays of the American future that I think is essential. Well, this is a brief kind of overview of where we are and rushing through it in 20 minutes so we can get to a dialogue and discussion. Let me just say, am by nature an optimistic person. And people frequently ask me whether I'm optimistic about the Latino future. Of course I am. I am, immensely so. I know our community. I live in the poorest census tract in San Antonio, in a neighborhood where we've created a learning center across the street from our home that receives 37 children from the local elementary school every day. I know these children by name, their instincts, their parents' ambitions for them. I know this population. I know the Dominican and Cuban and Puerto Rican and Salvadorians, and I know that this is a very solid basis on which to build an America that is strong and prosperous and has no danger looking back from the end of this century and thinking about how Latinos were integrated in the American society and how we did our part to keep this country strong. I believe that. In my sober moments, when I look at some of the educational statistics and the employment numbers, I worry. You know, the nickel is sort of still in the air. The jury's out whether we're going to be able to do the things in public policy that make this possible. But believe me, left to the natural instincts of our people, this country's best days are still ahead, and in no small measure because these people we call the Latinos are among us. Thank you very much for allowing me to come over and be with you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for those terrific remarks. You can approach the microphones, and I'm asked to suggest that you ask questions rather than to give short speeches so that everybody can have a chance to talk. So, Secretary, I'll call on folks as they line up behind the mics, and there's people up in the rafters up there watching you as well. Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Selena Moreno.
And you're from San Antonio.
Thank you, Secretary, for coming. One of the questions I have related to immigration do you think of the winners and losers of NAFTA, which is closely related to immigration now that that's over a decade on NAFTA?
Well, I think that the idea of opening markets of free trade is always a good idea. I'm a believer in free trade, a believer in the effect in markets of opening up closed systems like Mexico's was to competition, banking, financial, other sectors. And so in general terms, I supported NAFTA and believe that on the whole, it is a net plus in the relationship between ourselves and Mexico. I think some things could have been done differently and better related to infrastructure investment on the border, related to job training for displaced workers in the United States, related to assuring that all sectors of Mexico open up, a society where oligarchs have frequently commanded and controlled whole sectors of the economy, and we didn't see enough loosening of that. There have been winners in parts of the United States where industry has grown, including in my state, in Texas. We are the beneficiaries in San Antonio of a $1.5 billion automotive plant that in part is located where it is in San Antonio because they see it as the mothership for eventual plant locations and exports into Mexico and Latin America. So there have been regions of the country that have been winners. I also build homes in Detroit, and I know what the effect has been in some parts of the Midwest where industries have gone abroad. I don't know that it's directly related to NAFTA because they've gone a lot of other places as well, but people in Michigan and Ohio and Illinois blame NAFTA for some of the industrial losses that they have suffered. In Mexico, I think the effect has been largely positive in terms of opening up systems that were very closed, but not enough. And unfortunately, the ineptness of the Fox administration, some of the difficulties at the end of the Salinas Gortari administration, I think Mexican officials took their eye off the ball and were not able to amass the kind of political strength to push through the kinds of reforms that we would like to see in Mexico. I am Mexican American, but not naive about Mexico. My mother was born in Mexico. My grandfather's from Mexico. I grew up with all of the trappings of a Mexicano family, but I will tell you, I don't like their oligarchic system of command of families controlling massive parts of enterprises. I think Carlos Slim is about to pass Bill Gates as the richest man in the world in a country with massive poverty. And that's just, that doesn't say a lot, but it says something about the kinds of resources that can be amassed even in a poor society. So a lot more needs to be done to open up. But again, I'm not ducking the issue of NAFTA. I supported it then, and I think on the whole, it was a positive thing, and support other free trade agreements, Central America, Mercosur, and others that will follow in due course and begin to open up a free trade set of relationships across the Americas with appropriate labor, environmental safeguards. Yes, sir.
Secretary, thank you very much for the presentation. Lawrence Walmsley, MPA here. I want to ask about the politics of this, how it's going to play out. Sorry, a bit too tall.
This being
the movement, the growth,
Latino growth
in the population. So broadly speaking, economically, Hispanics tend to be more liberal, government support and help for lower income families, which will put them on the left side of the spectrum. But socially tend to be more conservative. The religious people, abortion and gays is more of an issue. So how is that going to play out between the two parties? Obviously, they're going to be more and more focused on trying to get the vote as people get registered. And how will the organizers be affected by knowing that the national parties are starting to focus on them?
Interesting question. I would just sort of maybe take some issue with the premise that it is as sort of simple as a yeah. But for example, the first cut is that not all Latinos can be called Latinos for political purposes, because the Cuban American population has a distinctly different set of agenda issues, even on the points you mentioned, than the Puerto Rican community in New York or than the Mexican American community in Los Angeles. So the first difference is sort of some of the inter-ethnic differences and regional differences. Then there are questions, I think sort of one of the main distinctions within the Latino community is time in country. That is to say, first generation, second generation, third generation, so that the politics change as people are in the country for a longer period of time. Factors like intermarriage. Something like 20+% of Latinos are now and Latinas are now marrying persons who are not Latinos and Latinas, and that, you know, the politics changes as people sort of live their family life in different settings and so forth. So let me just kind of think out loud here, because I don't know where this is going, except to say that while Latinos, on the whole, tilt to the Democratic Party, not because they want social programs, but because they want investment in things like education and small business and aging people, but not the income supports. They're conservative with respect to that. But they do believe they do believe that government has a role in setting the stage, particularly in education. That makes them Democrats, but more conservative on some of the social questions. And President Reagan had a good measure of support from Latinos because of his abortion stands and so forth. What I think we'll see is that while Latinos are in those earlier phases of life development that require governmental assistance, they will be Democrats. And then later, a second and third generation that get the advanced degree and the engineering job and the corporate position and the successful entrepreneur with multiple businesses paying lots of taxes, that they will gravitate toward being Republicans. So I see, a kind of a 30-year period here where both parties are vying. Latinos tend to be more sort of traditionally leaning Democratic, and then I think it's up for grabs down the road. Both parties understand this. The Republicans are sort of having more trouble with it, although Democrats are having their own kind of trouble, which I'll speak to in a minute. But Republicans are in danger right this minute of doing nationally what Pete Wilson did to them in California. In California, Pete Wilson saw the advantage of playing Latinos as a wedge issue, immigrants particularly, as a wedge issue, and was not prepared for how fast the numbers in California were going to tilt the politics of California. And when they did, the momentary advantage of the wedge issue that served him well in a couple of elections has made California a reliably blue state on the basis of Latino anger about how Republicans were defined in California. This immigration fight has the opportunity, with voices like Tancredo of California and others, to do the same thing on a national scale, which would be a disaster from a Republican electoral standpoint, because Latinos are going to be that important in that many different big electoral states, right? So, barring something like that, I think it's probably a fair fight. And smart Republicans, including the way President Bush has handled Latinos, it was said when he came to office that he would be as friendly to Latinos as President Clinton was to African Americans in kind of imagery and identity and connection. And I think he's played this immigration question precisely correctly until now. Now, at the very last minute, in order to satisfy the right, he's imposing these long waits and return to your country and pay $10,000 and all these kinds of things that may blow it up. And if they blow it up, then he's lost his advantage on that question. So forgive me for sort of going way around the maypole, but I think that in the short run, sort of Democrats have the advantage in access. In the long run, this community's up for grabs. Next question.
Yeah,
Up here.
My name is Ernesto Martinez. I'm a PhD student here at Harvard. And
Ernesto?
Yeah, so first off, I'm really, really proud to be here because I would see posters of you when I was in high school. And
Where are you from, Ernesto?
I'm a Chicano from California, from
California.
a small city called El Centro. My question is, how do we keep this momentum, like this high, optimism going in times of economic downfalls, So when people were celebrating Villa Ragosa, I was like, well, we already had a Latino mayor, yourself, right, at a big city. But in times of economic hardship, we have this big, what you described earlier, wedge campaigns of just let's hit the most vulnerable group. Let's go after the immigrants, right?
Yeah.
Which in itself stigmatizes third generation Mexican Americans like myself or all these other things.
Right.
And even in the recent economic downfall, we saw the surgence of Minutemen. Yeah. So in your political experience, how do you would recommend to keep this momentum going even when our economy is not doing well and the easy targets will be Latinos? So.
Well, I think the initiative rests with us to continue to be positive and build on the momentum that we've created. What I tried to describe in that sort of framework that I laid out was an acceptance of a responsibility for our own destiny and for our place in the country. It's a little bit different than we thought about it before. We've always thought about, what should the country do for us, or what should we explain to the country it must do for reasons of fairness or humanitarian motives. I'm not saying that that's the right. I'm saying it's time to. This country, this nation, which we love and want to be stronger and better, requires that we reach our full potential. Now, more Americans have to see that. We've got to make that message clear to more Americans that when they deny us education, they're hurting the country in the long run. When our people are not able to release their full entrepreneurial energies, this country is hurt in the long run. But at least the initial impetus in that idea, in that theme, rests with us. And it means, never giving up and being completely relentlessly optimistic about what we have to do. We have to have our own agenda for educational progress, our own agenda for entrepreneurship, our own agenda for healthcare, our own agenda for political empowerment at the local level and at school boards, et cetera. And my sense is our people are optimistic in that way. And the combination of the population gains, which I tried to describe, the economic gains, which are consistently newer and stronger, even in a turned-down time like you're describing, are such that we're continually making new beachheads, establishing new thresholds, reaching new firsts. And the trick is to just continue to drive those to the kind of progress that we want to create. I don't know whether that's a good answer for your question, but that's my answer.
When you say us, are you referring to who exactly?
National Latino community.
Working class, middle class?
Everybody. Everybody. Up here.
Hi, Mr. Cisneros. My name is David Escamilla. I'm a freshman at the college, and I'm from Dallas, Texas, which is a city that is currently undergoing a lot of urban development. So I wanted to get your opinion on whether...
100% increase in the Latino population in Dallas in the last decade. 100%. Mostly immigrants.
Yeah. So I wanted to get your opinion as to if there are any cultural or economic benefits to having the Latino community develop in an urban environment as it is starting to in Dallas, as opposed to, say, a suburban or even a rural environment?
Well, I think the benefits are the same as they would be for any other population, which is to say, of avoiding the hassles of congestion and long commutes and expensive commutes and all of those things. There's a very bright young man, MIT graduate, named Michael Mendez in California, who wrote his, I think, master's thesis on the subject of what he calls Latino new urbanism. There is a movement in architecture called the new urbanism, which speaks to smaller, sort of denser communities, infill communities, transit-oriented development. Walkability is the big concept, tight, dense, walkable, et cetera. And he argues that that is a natural state for Latino communities, that that's the values we enjoy and want, and that if someone was building communities with those attributes, They would be very natural in Latino settings. As you drive through an East Los Angeles or a West San Antonio or the Latino communities of Dallas or Houston, you see those aspects that people try to create in new urbanist communities already on the ground in Latino settings. So yeah, I think there are multiple benefits at all levels of creating cohesive, well-designed communities closer to the heart of employment. I mean, it breaks my heart when I drive, and Louis, you've probably seen this in Los Angeles. Louis is originally from LA and was a state assemblyman there. Breaks my heart to drive through the west side of Los Angeles, Brentwood, Pacific Palisades on a Saturday night coming from some social function and see Latino women, older and younger, at bus stops for the multiple transfers they're going to have to make to drive, to go 40 miles to the Inland Empire or some far-flung place because they cannot live in central Los Angeles. The communities are built out and too expensive, and so would it be healthier if they could live close by? Absolutely. I mean, that's just one example of the burdens imposed on people by the patterns of affordability and segregation that characterize so many of our metropolitan areas for poor people. Question over here. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Cynthia Martinez. I'm a second-year MPP student here, and I'm actually originally from McAllen, Texas.
McAllen.
I have a question regarding...
In the Valley of Texas, a million Latinos.
Everybody looks like
From
me.
Brownsville to McAllen. Everybody looks like us.
Moving to the East Coast was a real shock.
I had a businessman from San Antonio move to the Valley a few years back, and he came back and he said, if I'd have wanted to move to Mexico, I'd have moved to Mexico. So he came back.
This is true. I agree with a lot of what you said about crafting our own agenda and about the issues that we need to face within this community. And based on the numbers and the way this community is growing, if you look at the last 5 years, it seems like the Latino community has not been politically energized. You look back at, for example, like 2002 and the Latino community in Texas and the way they reacted to Tony Sanchez. In 2004, the way that the Bush and the Kerry campaign spent more money than ever on Spanish language media and advertising. You look right now at the immigration debate that's going on within Texas and the way that Bill Richardson is being received as a candidate. And especially right now in an era when immigration is a major issue, and I feel like on the national level, the narrative is being characterized and controlled by people like Tom Tancredo and people like Bill O'Reilly. I guess the question is, how do we then translate these numbers into political power? What do we do to politically invigorate this community and take back that narrative?
It's a good question, and I would argue that it's not as bleak a picture of progress as you have described, that we've made very substantial progress. Now, many of the races that you described are more a function of the dynamics of that race and the people involved. The Tony Sanchez race, for example. Tony's a friend, but he didn't run a very good race. And he had absolutely no background in public policy. He was a banker and easily attackable and so forth. But let's not get into that race. By contrast, let me say, you have successes like the 3 United States senators that I described, where we had 0 6 years ago. You've got the mayor of major cities like Antonio Villaraigosa. First race, he didn't quite make it. Second race, he made it. He's doing very well. His honeymoon continues. He'll win a second term, I think, relatively easily, and he may be a future governor of California. And we see that kind of measurable progress, measured progress in the size of the Hispanic Congressional Caucus, which is now 20-plus people, in the incubators, 5,000 public officials, Latino public officials across the country in school boards, county commissions, city councils, the incubators of talent that will be state representatives and state senators and congresspeople down the road. I think, I'd like to see us move faster, but if you talk to people like Antonio Gonzalez at Southwest Voter and Juan Andrade at the U.S. Hispanic Leadership Institute in Chicago, they can give you the numbers of the increases in Latino voter participation that in some cases exceed the white population's voter participation rates in some places and in some races. So I think we're making some pretty substantial progress. O'Reilly and Tancredo are loud, but I think it stretches us to say they command the narrative of the present public dialogue. They're a factor, they're trouble, but you know, we don't do badly at making our case as well. So, you know, again, call me an optimist, but I think we're making, you know, good progress. Bill Richardson, you know, I'm supporting Bill Richardson, much to Hillary Clinton's, you know, dissatisfaction with me as a human being, as a person. You know, you don't envy me having to have that face-to-face conversation, which I did. And Obama is incredibly attractive, but I'm for Bill Richardson because it's hard for me to make a speech like this talking about the emergence of the Latino moment, and here's a legitimate candidate with a record, with a resume, and saying, oh, except for him, I don't support him. So I'm for Bill Richardson, but Bill Richardson's not going to win the presidential nomination. I don't think. I mean, there's maybe some outside moment where lightning strikes and this happens, but it's important that the first Latino who runs for president, who actually goes to New Hampshire and competes in the New Hampshire primary, you know, do a credible job and have support from our community. Now, what number is he going to get? I don't know, but I would not say that's indicative of, you know, any Latino failure if he doesn't win the nomination. It's the nature of the American presidential process and the time span over which this will play out. Let me ask this audience. How many in this audience believe that the first Latino president of the United States is now alive? Is that person? Yeah. Is that 3 election cycles from now or 5 election cycles from now? Is it 20 years from now or 30 years? I don't know. And I don't know whether that little girl is in kindergarten or that little boy is in, or that young man is in law school. I don't know. Maybe a member of a legislature, or maybe it's mayor of Los Angeles. I don't know. No, I don't think so. No, Steve's already decided he wants to be a professor here. No, but I mean, is that person alive? Yeah, I think probably so. And we're going to watch that progress unfold in our lifetime. Yes, ma'am. I think we can hear you.
I'll be loud. The policy issues we spoke on related to immigration had to do with 2 areas. One, he said that increasing sanctions on employers who hire undocumented immigrants is essential. And he said that follow through on the Real ID Act so that all Americans have an ID that meets federal standards is essential. He also said that these are 2 policies that most of America and most Americans that he speaks with are calling for. I'm interested in your view on these 2 policies and whether you think that they'll be helpful or hurtful to American communities.
I think they will end up being part of immigration reform. The employer sanctions are difficult to enforce. We've seen, you know, businesses shut down in communities because they're raided. It happened recently in the Midwest, and 200 people were carted away, and a company had to close, and it was the main industry of the town. So it's all a question of, you know, how the bureaucracy can staff up to do this in a way that's not overly intrusive and that is fair. But obviously, if we have a law that says you've got to be legal to work, and we accompany that with a functioning guest worker program and a path to citizenship, then requiring people to have accurate documents and employers to observe them is part of the process. So if we're able to do this as part of an integral strategy, then, you know, I have no problem with it. It's going to be part of the reforms. Okay? Let's go up here and then we'll come back to you. Yes, sir.
Hi, sir. My name is Luis Martinez, MPP, 1986.
Okay.
I really believe, in my experience, that true and lasting empowerment begins with financial education and home ownership. And I wanted to ask you, is that a good focus of where our efforts should be, helping the Latino community become homeowners, helping them to understand the financial process, helping them to understand the whole system of credit in this country?
Absolutely. When I spoke of the kind of the public policy areas that I believe are part and parcel of keeping this path to the middle class open, I mentioned education, and the second thing I mentioned was income strategies. Home ownership is part of that. Banking the unbanked is part of that. Strategies for ending these predatory and unscrupulous abuses is part of that. There are some very interesting ideas out there in the country that I think would be important to our community, and that I spoke last week at a Tomas Rivera Policy Institute workshop specifically on income-related strategies. For example, there's a strategy called lifetime learning accounts, which sort of borrows on something that Tony Blair did in England and is being talked about for our country, which would be the creation of an account with $500 in it for every child at the time of their birth, to be drawn down, to be managed by the government over the course of their life, to be eligible to be drawn down at 18 years of age for education, with accompanying tax policy that would allow families to match it as best they could and get a tax credit for the match. But the suggestion is that over a span of 18 years, that money would grow dramatically and amount to billions of dollars for just the first cohort. It cost $2.1 billion to seed the first group, and the return is like $121 billion at the end of 18 years, thanks to the magic of compound interest rates, interest and matching of families, and tax policy. The total amount for all of the cohorts over an 18-year span would have a sum of $900 billion in it available for education, to be withdrawn for education, properly managed over the span of that period of time. So those are the kinds of ideas that go right to the heart of income strategies, which are important. No community has a greater stake in money being made available for education than our community. This ought to be something we champion. There's another variation on this thing called SEED, S-E-E-D, which is money can be withdrawn for education, for entrepreneurship, or for down payment. S-E-E-D, E-E-D, education, entrepreneurship, down payment. So it goes beyond just withdrawing the money for education or training, but withdrawing the money for these other strategies, which various serious academic groups have called the way we built the American middle class. Home ownership, access to higher education, and these kinds of income and entrepreneurship strategies. Steve, let me just, okay, good. Let me just finish one quick additional point on this, because it's something I'm working on now, and I had hoped to mention it earlier. Working on a program that tries to build on these 4 pieces that I described earlier: the recognition of our significance to the country, our acceptance of responsibility for the country, the integration of immigrants in the process, and a plea to America to keep the doors open while we're working, so that we can participate in this ladder that has characterized this country. And the focus of this effort, that I've been very fortunate in my life to have started a number of things that other people have picked up and built on, and hopefully this is the next iteration. We're calling it Our Pledge. Nuestro juramento, our pledge. The word juramento in Spanish means pledge, but it's even stronger, because when you say yo juro, you mean I'm willing to fight for this, I'm willing to die for this. And so it's a play on the concept of our pledge of allegiance. But basically what we hope to draft is a sort of an organization that works on a sort of reciprocal contract, right? And the contract from a Latino standpoint is, in 15 years, I want to work so that I'm completely proficient in English, so that my children are en route to a better life than I have had economically and educationally. I want to be a citizen and participate in the civic life of the country. I want to have a path to home ownership and retirement. But basically, I'm prepared to engage in the civic life of this country, including call to duty to serve it if I need to, right? But I am signing on to the American way of life. Beyond the technicalities of legalization, right? I'm aboard. Count me aboard for America, right? On the other hand, I want to live in a country that recognizes I'm a human being and treats me with a dimension of fairness and keeps the pathways to opportunities open, right? Doesn't shut down public education in the interest of vouchers or private schools or other things, as an aging population has less interest or attention for public schools, etc. But a kind of a sophisticated reciprocality that says, I will work, but give me the opportunity, give me the chance, and I'll help you build this country. That's what we're going to try to build. And I'm hopeful that, you know, it's in part a communication strategy, sort of start the discussion in this hopefully post-immigration reform era, or maybe even essential to get immigration reform, right? But on the other hand, it also says to the country, rather, it's in part a communication strategy, but it's also a real strategy of engaging allies and organizations to make it possible for these pieces to happen. A real pathway to home ownership, a real pathway to savings, a real pathway to banking and financial literacy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Henry. I'm Ana Maria Salazar. I'm a Harvard Law class of '89. And I also worked with the Clinton administration for 6 years. I was at the Pentagon. A week before Clinton left, I decided to move to Mexico, and I'm now a TV host and a radio host. And I've had the opportunity to view the immigration issue from the Mexican perspective. And there's a problem and that I'm worried that it's not being discussed, which makes me believe that even though there is good possibilities that there's going to be some type of immigration legislation coming up, if not soon, in the next couple of years, it's going to create perhaps a bigger problem because we're not resolving the bottom line, which is how do you have Mexico and the United States being neighbors when there's such discrepancies in economies?
Mm-hmm.
And the problem that we don't want to talk about is that once this immigration law is approved, and hopefully they do legalize the 8 million Latinos or undocumented workers that are living in the United States, it's going to open up a bigger problem in the sense that there's going to be no incentives for Mexican workers, for Central American workers, not to come to the United States in undocumented fashion. And we don't want to talk about it because that would kind of mess up and make this other, just the way we discuss the immigration legislation right now, could, you know, it just create bigger problems. And the bottom line is, from a Mexican perspective, Mexico needs, almost for national security reasons, to keep that border open, because regardless of what Felipe Calderon does in the next couple of years in trying to improve employment, it's not going to be reflected in terms of reducing illegal immigration or documented immigration in the next 6 or 7 years. Yeah. And from the U.S. perspective, from national security reasons, the border, there has to be more control on the border. So I've been thinking and writing about this, and I just don't know. I fear that what could happen in the next years, once this legislation is approved, that there will be a new wave of immigration coming to the United States, more family reunification,
right.
And the political impact in the United States could be a long-term, you know, psychosis of more anti-migrant sentiment.
Of course, the logic of the reform is that you do legalize the 8, legalize in the sense of a guest worker program, right? So instead of people living in the shadows, people living in hiding, people living with abuses, they have permits. So they can visit their families instead of the present situation where families don't see each other for years and become separated, very family unfriendly reality, and are protected. They're legitimate people with rights in a legal system. So it doesn't stay that way, and there's, as I said earlier, not a permanent underclass of guest workers in the country. There's a earned path to citizenship, which you pass a number of tests, including time and law-abiding tenure and so forth, and you become citizen. But the accompanying piece to that is serious border controls, And so that's where the business of the wall, which I don't think works as serious a control, but the wall, the virtual electronic wall, the blimps, the increases for the Border Patrol, all of that, okay, is an accompanying piece of this. And then I think the thing that probably does work is the question that was raised earlier about employer sanctions at the workplace, because that's where the chokehold is. In other words, if people cannot get a job in a system that's got legal processes, then they go home because there's no work, right? So the betting is that when you put these three pieces together, and that's why the three are important. You know, there's people who like the border control piece, but they don't like the other, so that means they're willing to leave 8 million people here living in the shadows, et cetera. Or they like the guest worker, but they don't like the citizenship piece, so that means they're willing to leave people here in a permanent The three pieces have to go together. And the president, you know, to his credit, understood this from the beginning and was willing to take on his own right wing to hold the three pieces together. Again, the devil's in the details, and we're seeing some sort of fading at the edges, which may blow it up, may not happen. And if it doesn't happen in the next couple of months, it won't happen this year. And if it doesn't happen this year, it's not going to happen in a presidential year, so we're past 08, we're into 09 before we get any serious reform. But that's the logic, okay, that the pieces hold. Now, can Mexico survive without illegal immigration to be its safety valve? I don't know the answer to that question. But, you know, the hope is that between the opening that NAFTA represented and globalization and other factors and there's been some slowing in the Mexican birth rate, so some of the pressures on employment are not as great as they were before, that Mexico can begin to, you know, stand on its own 2 feet as an economy and employ its people. And maybe there's things we need to do in that process along the lines of World Bank and North American Development Bank and other strategies to help Mexico. But I think that if indeed there is immigration reform of the kind that I've just described with the three pieces, the assumption is that that illegal immigration is not going to be the massive force that it was. Now, we may be all completely wrong about this, and human ingenuity is so great that no wall, virtual or otherwise, will stop people when they're hungry and they want to come here, and we'll be back having this debate in 20 years with, you know, another version of it. Because this is 20 years from the 1986 Immigration Reform Act that had amnesty provisions in it. That's the best answer I can give you.
Last question up here, and then we'll be through.
Yes, sir.
Secretary Cisneros,
Yes.
buenas noches.
Buenas noches.
My name is Pablo Quintanilla. I'm a second-year student and a member of the Latino Caucus.
And where are you from?
I'm from both Mexico and the United States.
Very good.
I was here last week listening to Flash, who is sitting in front of you, who was the keynote speaker for the Black Policy Conference.
Very good.
And he was addressing some of the same issues you were. Both the African-American community and the Latino community rank low in many of these measures which you mentioned tonight. So what areas do you see or you recognize where these two communities could build coalitions?
Well, it's a very good question, and there's some impressive people working on this. Flash, I don't know whether you've met a professor at Georgia Tech named Ramona Houston, but she's working specifically on this question of African-American Latino relations. First of all, I think this question works out most practically in communities across the country. There are places where Latinos and African Americans work very well together in a political structure. Witness Chicago, where, you know, Chicago politics is rough and tumble, but at the end of the day, you work it out. And the African American community and the Latino community are having to work it out, and you know, kind of figuring out strategies for communication and collaboration. Mayor Villaraigosa, I think, has done a good job of you know, working with Maxine Waters and the other traditional leaders of the African American community who opposed him in the first election, and he lost, right? Because they thought that their long-standing alliance with a white mayor would suffer. That is to say, they would if they switched horses and went to Villaraigosa back then, would yield less than the kind of triangulation strategy that they had going at the time. But after Han so disappointed them during his term, Villaraigosa was standing there with an impeccable record on African American issues. They came to him, and it sort of worked in this second iteration. So this is about politics, right? But this is what politics is. It's about dialogue and finding the common ground, and, you know, arm wrestling when necessary, and flexing muscle when necessary, and in the end, reaching some accommodation. And it's happening in communities across the country. Now, Substantively, to answer your question, what issues, what subjects, what content? Clearly, we have a massive stake in Central City schools. Whether it's Los Angeles, where there's 700,000 children in the Los Angeles school system, and about 90% of it is minority. And you could go on around the country and talk about most any major city school system. Hartford, Boston, New York, Chicago. I mean, give me the numbers, and 70% of the school district is going to be minority in most of those places. And it's going to be, in many places, African Americans, traditionally the largest number of that minority, Latinos growing fast, you know, children together in the same schools and transition neighborhoods, all of those issues. So clearly investment in Central City schools. We have a massive, massive imperative to sustain the quality of schools and education if we have any hope of enacting an optimistic agenda like the one I've tried to describe this evening. I said the nickel is in the air on this question. And the determinant, more than any other, of how that nickel comes down is the quality of the public schools, more than anything else. Right? But that's one issue. Another set of issues relate to small business development, contracting, procurement, the whole enterprise agenda, hugely important for Latinos and African Americans to work together. A variation on President Clinton's mend it but don't end it strategy for affirmative action. You know, we have a common stake in that. You know, this is not yet well defined, this income agenda that I described, but we've got to get income into people's hands because more and more families are being affected by the wage problems in American enterprise, the consolidation, the effects of outsourcing and so forth. And you know, unions are not playing the role that they once did. Look how long it's taken to get a minimum wage increase. It's been a decade since we had an increase in the minimum wage. Poor families are hurting badly. And you know, there's enlightened mayors like Bart Peterson in Mayor Goldsmith's hometown, Indianapolis, who has a plan he calls Indy Saves. It's making national news in municipal circles. You know, earned income tax credit, individual development accounts, bank strategies for banking people who otherwise can't get it, using remittances and people's need to be able to send money as the opening to offering them banking for money that they can save in the United States, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Very sophisticated. Cities are using municipal libraries and literacy centers and things that were built for other purposes now to offer this sort of pathway to the middle class strategy, because they know that this is an important, you know, strategy, and if our federal government is not going to do it, and if our market is not doing it, then we have to do it in these physical places that are our communities. So those are the kinds of things where Latinos and African Americans ought to be working together. Some places it works well. Maybe it depends on the personalities who are in leadership. In other places it doesn't work so well. Sometimes it sort of takes an iteration or two for it to sort out. But you know, in the long haul, we have to work together because we inherit these places we call America's cities, and it just becomes obvious that unless we're going to let them go away on our watch, we've got to work together.
My quick answer to that point is I would urge all African Americans to learn Spanish and take the pledge.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your terrific, insightful, and exuberant remarks. Thank you so much. We're adjourned.